Bills, second reading, projet de loi, deuxième lecture, number 1, Bill C18.
On debate, Senator Housakis.
Thank you, honourable colleagues. I rise today to speak to Bill C18, the Online News Act. A few weeks ago, the bill's sponsor, Senator Harder, said he hoped that we could all agree that action is needed to address the challenges faced by the Canadian news sector at this time. I do agree that legacy news media in this country are facing challenges and they're struggling to compete with online news outlets and platforms for eyeballs and for advertising revenue. Some are struggling more than others, and I think that's something that should be included in any study of this legislation. Why are some succeeding where others are failing? That's partly where I take issue with this legislation, that it establishes as its baseline that journalism as a whole is in peril in this country. Where I take further issue is that is a problem that warrants government intervention. I have difficulty wrapping my head around the notion that government sticking its nose in somehow ensures a free and independent news media. The two don't really go together. There's no denying that bricks-and-mortar newsrooms in Canada are being decimated, in particular newspaper publishers and small independent outlets. Canadians, like everyone else in the world, are consuming news differently. More and more, they're turning to online platforms for content, and advertisers are following them. As a result, legacy media are now forced to compete for ad revenue over which they used to enjoy a monopoly. But colleagues, if they're unable to successfully do so, that's a problem with their business model, not with journalism at large. So let's be honest about the intent of this legislation. It's not about preserving free and independent press that, yes, I agree, is so vital to a healthy democracy. It's about preserving a system of journalism with which we are familiar and comfortable, and in the case of a current government, has also served them well. For a government that proclaims to embrace innovation and technology, unlike any government before them, they keep drafting legislation that punishes and disincentivizes innovation. The simple fact is, government has no business in the news business in a robust and a healthy democracy. When a government steps in to dictate what qualifies as quality or professional news and starts handing out financial support on that basis, that is no longer a free and independent news media. Colleagues, it's human nature to distrust someone whose very survival is dependent on another person or entity. It's why we have conflict of interest laws and codes. Even the appearance of a possible conflict is to be avoided. That is especially true when it comes to news media. I'm very disappointed to see the government, including the sponsor of this bill here in the Senate, using the prospect of fighting disinformation and misinformation as justification for this legislation, as if only the government or its proxies can be the arbiter of what information is worthy of consuming. It's very dangerous, colleagues. Yet it keeps coming up, even after a member in the House of Commons was forced to apologize. Liberal member of Parliament and a former journalist herself, Lisa Hefner, claimed in committee during study of C18 that, and I quote her, "Well, see the argument that a couple hundred online news organizations have popped up in that time. What we don't see is that they're not news. They're not news. They're publishing opinion only." End of quote. In an apology she was forced to issue over that comment, MP Hefner couldn't help herself and again denigrated online news by implying that most of them are not trusted sources of news, but rather sources of fake news. Colleagues, you scoff at our suggestions that all of these pieces of legislation, this bill and its predecessor C11, are attempts by the Trudeau government to control what Canadians see online, but the truth is, the call is coming from inside the House, literally. While we're on the topic of mis- and disinformation, let's talk about the complete misrepresentation of how news is being shared on Facebook and Google and what this legislation will supposedly do. Liberal MP Hefner, again, described it in the following way in a tweet after C18's passage in the House of Commons. She tweeted that it would, and I quote, "make it harder for big digital platforms like Facebook and Google to steal local journalists' articles and repost them with credit." End of quote. That is such an appalling distortion of facts and reality from a member of a government that talks ad nauseum about combating misinformation and disinformation online. And then they go ahead and perpetuate it. These platforms don't steal content. If anything, they're actually showcasing the work of journalists and driving traffic to legacy media on their websites, just like they showcase our work when we post our own content as politicians. Ms. Hefner makes it sound like Facebook and Google are out there copying and pasting content and trying to pass it off as their own. Colleagues, that's ludicrous. In the case of Facebook, its users, people like you and all of us, are providing links to news items that take you to their originating website, whether it is CTV News or CBC or Western Standard or any one of these outlets. It's the same with Google. Whether you're looking at Google News, which is an aggregator that clearly identifies the source of the story and links directly to that site, or when you're using Google as a search engine, where it again brings you directly to the originating site of the journalist's story. There's no stealing of content, nor failure to properly credit anyone or any outlet for their work. Accusing the platforms of theft would be like a restaurant accusing a cab driver of stealing their customers when they drop him off at the door. It's ludicrous. Yes, these online platforms have found a way to financially benefit from the work of others. And in turn, with only so much ad revenue to go around, it cuts into the profits of the media outlets, no doubt. But let's stick with the analogy of the cab driver in the restaurant. If a couple is dining out, and they know they want to have a few drinks at dinner and don't want to drive, so they take a cab to and from the restaurant. They only have so much budget for their evening, so they know they have to deduct the cab fare from the amount they had set aside at the restaurant. Logical. Is the restaurant owner now going to say to the cab driver, okay, you owe me a portion of the fare? No, he or she is thankful for the business, colleagues, especially in today's world where food delivery services are already draining lots of businesses from in-house dining. Those same restaurants, by the way, have to adapt as a result of those food delivery services and the new way of technology and how we order from restaurants. The same way news media will have to adapt to the digital world, and some have adapted to that world. By the way, nobody is forcing news media to make their content available online to be shared on platforms like Facebook and Google. They choose to post the content themselves and encourage others to share it by putting those little icons for sharing available on every item. They know the benefit that they derive from having their content shared, magnified. In the case of Google, media outlets proactively make their content available to show up in Google search by enabling what's called their RSS feed. They could just not enable that feed. And in the case of sharing on other platforms, they can just put their content behind a paywall. A digital subscription is no different than a paid subscription. It's difficult to accuse someone of stealing something that's on offer for free. Recently, Google carried out what they called the test here in Canada, in which they stopped providing links to Canadian news for what they say was less than 4% of the population in Canada. Government officials went off accusing them of stealing content and accusing them of blocking content. I'll go back to my restaurant analogy. It would be like the cab driver saying, okay, I don't want to be accused of stealing your customer, so I won't bring people to your restaurant anymore. And then the restaurant manager accuses him of stopping customers from going to his restaurant. Colleagues, do we not see the ridiculousness of all this? Furthermore, it's just not true. During Google's tests, not one Canadian was prevented from accessing whatever news site we wanted to access. Not one. That's not how the internet works. It's not about defending big tech, as I'm sure I will be accused of that. It's about being factual and speaking plainly about what the reality of the situation is. We have a government engaging in various degrees of misinformation when they claim to want to combat, just as they are engaging in the very bullying and intimidation of which they're accusing Alphabet and Meta, the parent companies of Google and Facebook. That was the reaction of the Trudeau government to Google's recent test and to Meta making it clear that they are forced to pay every time one of its members shares a link to a news article in Canada. They will halt practicing altogether. They will simply say, don't use our platform. Use another search engine. Nobody forces a journalist to use Google or any other platform. It's free. It's called freedom. You have a choice. These two companies are engaging in a good old-fashioned game of chicken. They're calling the government's bluff, and it's no surprise that the government is reacting negatively to it. However, that does not justify that the government did in retribution. For those who may not be aware, Google was called on the carpet to explain their decision to carry out their tests. Not only was the witness from Google intimidated by MP Chris Biddle, he seems to be turning that into an art form, he was going so far as to state that perhaps they would have to consult with the law clerk to determine what further could be done because Mr. Biddle simply wasn't satisfied with the response he got. The government used that parliamentary committee to compel the production of third-party correspondence from these two companies as it relates to a bill that is no longer even in that chamber for consideration, colleagues. We're talking about correspondence between these entities and private citizens voicing opposition to this government's legislation, and this government is demanding that is turned over. Talk about witch hunts. Talk about inadvertently browbeating and arm-twisting witnesses. To what end? What purpose does this serve? Never mind how rich it is for a government to demand a level of transparency for mothers that has gone to great lengths to avoid providing itself. This is the kind of strong arming we'd expect in Beijing or Tehran or Havana or even from the mob. It's not supposed to be how we conduct ourselves in a free, democratic society. It's the kind of witness intimidation we saw from the same member of government during their and our study at C18, colleagues. I know it's easy to demonize online platforms, in particular Alphabet and Meta, who are the parent companies of Google and Facebook. There's certainly been a lot of it in this chamber and committee over the past several months, but this is beyond the pale. Colleagues, I understand the reflex of helping struggling newsrooms, especially in smaller, independent local ones. The government has certainly played on that sentiment. But the truth is, this bill will not breathe new life in struggling newspapers or upstart or ethnic venture newspapers. As a matter of fact, the bulk of the money collected through this scheme will actually go to big broadcasters, including none other than my beloved funded CBC. That's not me saying that. It's the Parliamentary Budget Officer, an independent officer of Parliament. According to an analysis carried out by the PBO, newspapers and online news outlets media would get less than a quarter of the funding collected from Facebook and Google. It's CBC, Bell, Shaw, and Rogers, our beloved telecommunications giants, who would stand to make $248 million from the scheme, while newspapers and smaller independent and ethnic online outlets would be left scrapping it out for the remaining $81 million. It's not me saying it, it's the PBO. Why is CBC even eligible for this funding anyway? They already have an advantage over all others by allowing them to compete for ad revenue while also receiving government funding of the tune of $1.4 billion a year. And now we're going to give them another leg up by allowing them to cut into this funding. If we want to help the smaller independent outlets, stop making them compete against CBC. If this legislation is passed, CBC should not be eligible for funding it generates, or even dollars they receive should be deducted from their government funding. In closing, I want to go back to something Senator Harder said about the newsrooms that do the heavy lifting and how their work must be supported and they must be fairly compensated. Few outlets, if any, in this town have done more heavy lifting in exposing the waste and ethical corruption of the current government than online outlet Blacklocks. They actually are one of these outlets I spoke about earlier that employs a business model of putting their content behind a paywall and charging a subscription fee. Yet this government, the Trudeau government, has been embroiled in years-long legal battle with Blacklocks because government departments and offices keep sharing their content without paying the subscription. That's why they've been before the courts for years. Think about it. This government is out there telling you that we must support free and open journalism and that these journalists must be fairly compensated for their work. Noble. All the while they're openly circumventing Blacklock's paywall and outright infringing on their copyright. That is actually stealing. And that is a parliamentary language. When somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them free and unwarranted, it's called stealing. So the government talking points on this legislation are beyond rich. No doubt they justify it by telling themselves that Blacklocks isn't what they consider a professional outlet providing quality news. That's because they criticize them. So anybody who criticizes them, they're not professional, they're fake, they're not quality. You see the parallels here? They would say that about any outlet, I think, that's highly critical of them. Even the Globe and Mail sometimes. Sometimes they're legitimate, sometimes they're not, depending on the news story. And that, colleagues, is precisely why the government and politicians have absolutely no business in the business of nuking. So thank you, colleagues, and I look forward to studying this bill at committee.